Hi, everybody. Welcome to Documentation Not Included, a tech industry podcast presented by DNI Stream, the live knowledge repository for software professionals. I always feel like I should do a little dance or something while I say that, but hey. It's Thursday, 7 p.m. British time. We're live on twitch.tv/DNI Stream. I am Josey Howarth, and as always, I am basically joined by the ultimate transformer. He who is epic, who is perfect in all ways, Chris Seabach. I'm inspired by your t-shirt today.
Yes, I haven't worn this one for a while because I put a little bit of weight on over the whole lockdown thing, and it's a bit tight. But it's actually all right on me at the moment. So I'm either losing weight or it's stretched out. But anyway, yes, hello Josey and hello to everybody in chat. As always, this is a live show, so please do get involved. Got any questions? You've got any comments? You've got anything to? If we say anything that is wrong, which I'm sure we will do at some point, please get involved and drop those comments in chat.
Absolutely. And of course, before we begin, it's always a little icebreaker, which is just a chance for us to ask a random question and just sort of get to know each other better and all the stuff that kind of goes with it. We try to keep it away from the actual topic itself or involving development in general. I was about to say Docker, but that's part of our show today. We'll get to that. So I have a question for you, Chris. If animals could talk, which animal would be the rudest?
The rudest.
The rudest
I
animal.
immediately jumped to Rude Dog from the 90s, but
wow.
no, not
Yeah,
not
if
him.
animals could talk, which one would be the rudest?
I mean, it's going to be cats, isn't it? It's got to be cats. As much as I love our cats, they are Fry. Our Fry is brilliant. He's like a dog. He's a faithful servant. You know, he'll fetch things. He comes to you for a love. Big Meow, on the other hand, he's so aloof, and there's a black cat that occasionally we catch in our back garden, and we catch him and he runs off. You know, we just open the door and he runs off, and he walks along the shelf or the fence rather. Doesn't even look at us. He just doesn't acknowledge our existence whatsoever. And even if we're nice and we're friendly to animals, but yeah, I think cats would be the rudest.
Whereas I would say honey badgers.
I think the most violent.
Well, I think that they strike me as they'd have knives and gangs.
You what, mate?
Yeah. Well, mate. Well, oh my god, I can't believe I just did that live on air. Oh, good. That. Yeah, but to me, I think potentially honey badgers would be really, really rude. Although I think if you want to get, depending upon what your definition of rude is, because that's something I learned being here in the UK. There's two types of rude. There's rude, tap at the nose kind of rude, and there's rude where there's a brashness and an abruptness to something.
I mean,
And I think if you want to go the tap the nose route, it would have to be bunnies.
yeah, maybe bunnies. Don't know.
Bunnies, rabbits, and hares.
The rudest. I don't know.
Tap that nose.
Yeah, I can't think of that. I don't really think of animals in that way, to be fair. I've got to be honest.
Anthropomorphizing animals. Hey.
Yeah. Right.
Yes.
Anyway, so yes, tonight's show, Josey's kind of already spoiled it, but we are going to talk, and that thing right below me, and everything previous, and the title and the advert, everything spoil it. We're talking about Docker today. Today's show is called Docker Disaster. So one of the things that is common around the dev world is Dockerize all the things. Docker is wonderful. Let's get every application and every service and everything we ever work with in the world Dockerized. And we want to explain. I want to explain today why that is a thing, why it's not always the case, and also kind of why not necessarily, because I've actually recently had one of the reasons of the show is called Docker Disaster. I've had a disaster with Docker that meant I had to completely format my machine. It was only a couple of days ago, so I'm on a brand new machine. I'm lucky we haven't had any technical difficulties yet, because I've had to feverishly install everything again. But yeah, so and Josey has very recently been getting involved with it, I think, for the first time. Is that right, Josey?
Not the first time. No,
Okay.
no. I've said before on the show, when I first started out with Docker, mine was a disaster. Bricked my machine. It completely bricked it. So my very first interactions with Docker were basically ick, and I never wanted to touch it again, which is why I went down the Vagrant route. And Vagrant over time has just become this bloated monstrosity. And then, I said, I might as well start looking into Docker just to see what's up, because, you explore things and you preach the Docker gospel. And so I said, I'll give it a shot. And when I gave it a shot, I was like, what? Okay, so it's changed. It's changed, and that's good. Um,
I think my
but
very first
yeah.
experiences with Docker were with my first experiences were with Docker Windows containers, which is where my problem came in this week that caused me issues. Because they weren't very stable, they didn't do what they were supposed to do, they were slow, they were bloated, but Windows is a bloated operating system in general, even Windows Core. They've got a new version called Windows Nano, which you can install in a Docker container, and I think it's only a couple of hundred meg. It's still bigger than a Linux container, and especially something like an Alpine Linux container, which is a tiny, tiny operating system. It's
Little footprint.
tens of megs. It's ridiculous how small it is. But with that comes some caveats. You can't use some of the common tools. I don't think Alpine even comes with a shell. I think it doesn't come with Bash. It comes with the base Linux shell. So you have to log in with SH rather than with Bash.
I honestly don't know. All I know is that for me, when I want to do file changes in my Docker containers right now, I actually have to use regex. So
Right.
I have to do some kind of executive thing with regex. Although,
Okay.
like I said in I think it was the last episode where we were talking about the things that we learned, I'm like, I can just have Vi present. It'll be
So
fine.
I suppose let's start with an explanation of what Docker is and why containerization is such a wonderful thing for people who might be listening who haven't experienced it, and they maybe they hear about it and they're like, well, why is it such a big thing? I haven't got time to learn it, so what does it do for me?
And it's worth noting, we have done topics and shows in the past on containerization in general.
Yeah.
So we'll be doing, I think, a rather high-arching overview
So we've
and
done a
stuff.
show on Docker specifically. We had Thornton Phyllis on
Yes.
quite a while back.
Yep.
So anyway, so Docker is essentially, I'm not going to get into the deep technical detail, but essentially it is a layer in your operating system that allows you to create tiny little operating systems that are cut down significantly, that don't do everything that your main operating system does, but on an app basis, an application basis. So let's say, for example, you have a website. Typically, a web app these days consists of at least 3 parts. Anything that's even remotely technical consists of at least 3 parts. One, well, I say that, there are exceptions, of course, but one, you've got a front end, which is the client side application, which is like a JavaScript application. It could be Angular, it could be Ember, it could be React, it could be anything.
Yep.
Then you've got another layer, which is your back end, which is usually an API of some description. It could be anything. It could be a WebSocket, it could be a RESTful service, it could be a WCF, a SOAP service, it could be anything. Then you've usually got some kind of persistence layer, and that's like your database. Now, in a Docker world, what we would do, instead of deploying all of those things to different servers like you would in a typical enterprise scenario, or even just one server, which you would in a standard kind of...
For many people who are curious about, that's the things like LAMP stacks or LAMP stacks, Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP, things like that. Each one of those can actually be done in a sort of a structured set point. Most people do it on one server.
Yeah, so,
That
well,
is
you say
the
most
most
people.
common.
Most people who don't work in the enterprise
Yeah,
do
but
this.
see, not everybody works enterprise, Chris.
But
Some of us,
even when you get to a certain point within applications, for example, I know plenty of small businesses that have database servers, and then they have application servers, and then they have
Yes.
client-side applications on workstations and things like that.
That is a fair point.
So anyway, either way, however you deploy your apps, we just talked about a stack, and as Josey just said, a LAMP stack or whatever. There's loads of different standards out there. It doesn't matter what your stack is. Yeah, I use a .NET and Angular stack, but there's probably a word for that, an acronym someone's come up with these days. But it doesn't matter. Basically, that is how a modern application is usually layered. Sometimes you just deploy them all onto a VPS, a virtual cloud system, which is, it requires all of the It requires all the binaries and the software developer kits and the tools and everything that you needed to run that application to be installed on the server. What Docker allows us to do is it allows us to separate each one of those elements, so a database, an API, and an Angular a web front end, into separate containers. They're not microservices, although you could have services in containers as well. But essentially, each one of those containers is completely isolated, and they communicate with each other over, potentially, in Docker's case, a virtual network as well. Yeah. So that network can be isolated in its own host, essentially, its own virtual host on your operating system, which means it also means that we can script up each of those applications individually, and that's where the beauty lies with developers, because instead of us having to have a workstation where we develop all the applications and we've got all the say again we're doing .NET, we've got the .NET framework installed, we've got all of our IDEs and tool sets installed, we've got Git, everything that we need to do things. Half of that stuff is, some of it might exist on a build server, some of it might exist on a web server somewhere, but if it doesn't, you have to install it sometimes. But with Docker containers, you can just set the container up line by line in something called a Dockerfile, and you can tell it exactly what to install, create an image for it, and then configure that image and provision that image, which allows you to scale based on the environment variables you pass to it. So you can create, from one image, you can create 200 databases, just like that. And that's what makes it wonderful.
Well, what also, in my opinion, makes it wonderful is the fact that if someone has that Docker Compose file or the Dockerfile, which you use to extend the configuration for what you're doing for that particular setup, they can get the exact same environment.
Yes.
And that allows everyone to be working together on the same types of platform. There is now I come from the world of PHP and stuff like that because I do a lot of WordPress development and work. And one of the most frustrating things for me and things that I have seen in the development community is it worked perfectly fine on my system. Those days are gone. At least they should be if you're working in a team. They really kind of should be.
Yeah.
And because there are multiple solutions and ways in which you can ensure that everyone's running the correct version of PHP, and that you are testing against the correct, like all of those things should be in the past.
And another beautiful thing about that,
love about Docker,
the fact that we've got the configuration in place means that we can version control the software deployments as well, which is a massive thing, because we can assert that at that moment in time, when we have that commit that we've pushed to the server and the CI and CD builds have kicked off, or even we've built them locally, built the containers and they work locally, we know that worked. We know that we can revert back to that particular configuration without having to go, right, we've got to reprovision the VM, or we've got to uninstall particular apps or reinstall frameworks. All of the maintenance overhead goes away. Yes, there's a bigger overhead with development. Yes, there is. There always is going to be that. But it makes it nicer.
Keeping your Docker Compose and your Dockerfile and everything working as it should be can at times be a small little development task unto itself, as I've recently figured out.
And that's the thing, there's lots of different elements as well. So we're going to talk specifically about Docker. There are other containerization systems out there, but Docker is the one that's become very, very popular. Almost every mainstream big company, I'm talking about Microsoft, Google, Amazon, they've all adopted it very widely. There is orchestration that sits with that as well, and usually the orchestration is either something like Docker Swarm or Kubernetes.
Kubernetes.
And these are things that have all of the companies that develop these tool sets are working with each other to get them all working together as a stack. I actually, off the top of my head, can't think of any other containerization solutions. I know there's Vagrant, but that's not a container.
No, Vagrant is more like a virtual environment. It's like VirtualBox or something from Oracle or whatever.
And I know Python has something like that as well, virtual environment. I think it's called a venv. That's the command line you put in. I saw someone playing with it the other day.
No idea. But I think that, in the end, we're just going to be focusing on the Docker side of things. Maybe someday we'll have someone on who can actually tell us about others. That would actually be great. If you're listening and you know something that we don't, please get in touch and
Yeah,
become
and
a guest so
tell
we
us the
can learn from
difference
you.
as well, and why we might
Yeah.
use one over the other.
Yep.
So yeah, we're going to talk about. Let's start talking about, in fact, things like
Yeah.
Docker services, Docker networks, Docker volumes, containers, etc.
Right.
So,
I
go on.
man, this is I will tell you, when I first decided to go back to trying to use Docker, which is more or less in this recent time. Also, you got ice cream being delivered. You've muted yourself so we can't hear the ice cream. Darn it. But when I went back and I got started, one of the things that always confused me was, well, how is it really set up? Because I was so used to using things like Vagrant or VirtualBox. And to me, that was, you spin up a server, you make certain the particular apps that you need on it are present, and off you go and, have fun. But when it came to Docker, I was presented with the Docker Compose file. Now, Docker Compose is actually pretty well explained in the Docker documentation. And I say that because the documentation kind of assumes you have a certain level of understanding of containerization or how Docker itself is designed to work. So for me, it was a lot of trial and error. And what I walked away with, and this is something I want to talk to or ask you, Chris, what I walked away from that is, when it comes to setting up your Docker Compose file, you pick your version of Docker Compose, which I think is the version of Docker that you're using. I like Well, okay, let's start there, because you start with the Docker Compose file. If you have a Docker Compose file and you have Docker installed, you can run the Compose file and you can get an entire setup. So let's start with Docker Compose. The very first thing you have in a Docker Compose file is a version, and then you have to pick a thing. When I
Okay.
s
So
Everywhere I look at a completely different number, and I'm like, "Well, how do I pick? How do I know I'm picking the right thing?"
So there's a couple of things here. First of all, Docker and Docker Compose are completely separate things. I say completely separate. Docker
That's no,
Compose
they
couldn't exist without Docker, of course, but Docker
right.
Compose is a separate application on Windows, which I'm assuming you're using for your development.
Correct.
Right? So on
I wish
Windows,
I had something else, but a Mac I can't work
if
with.
you're working on Linux, Docker, when you install Docker, I don't think any of the distributions of Docker come with Docker Compose by default. On Windows, Docker Compose comes as part of the Docker for Windows installation package. When you
Okay.
install on Windows Server, it's the same thing as Linux. You get Docker and you have to install Docker Compose separately, and it's just a download executable that you throw into a path directory or something like that. So that's the first thing. You can do everything that you need to do with Docker. What Docker Compose does is it makes it easy for you to run and orchestrate multiple containers in a development environment specifically.
Okay.
Now, a Docker Compose file is also compatible with Docker Swarm, and Docker Swarm is the production grade, enterprise level orchestration out of the box orchestration that comes with Docker. Generally, it doesn't. I mean, I've seen it being used and I've used it myself, but it generally isn't used in proper setups. You usually use something like Kubernetes because it's much more competent. There's a company, I think it's Miranda or something like that. They that's all they do is create and manage Kubernetes. So that is heavily integrated into containerization in general, not just Docker, but it's got some specific integrations with Docker. So Docker Compose, the versions in Docker Compose, all you really need to worry about is the difference between version 2 and version 3. I haven't used version 1 files, so I don't really know how bad or good they are. But version 2 and version 3 had some major changes. Version 3, I feel, when I've worked with the two different versions, I feel like they've moved away from allowing Docker Compose on a desktop machine, which is what Docker Compose is meant for development-based work. They've taken most of the things like the scale command and the resource allocation commands, such as how many CPUs that the Docker container has access to, how much memory it has access to. They've removed all of that from version 3 files. And the difference is syntax. There's some slight changes. They've removed some things, and they've maybe made the development experience a bit more easy. I use it a lot, Docker Compose.
So all I use is Docker Compose. But then again, like I said, well, I didn't say it live because Chris and I were talking this before we went on. I don't use Docker in a production
No.
setting.
So I have actually deployed Docker Compose in a production setting as well, but a
Right.
very, very small deployment setting. Docker Compose is used for our DNI website. We use it specifically to push. I use it specifically to. Okay, so I push the code. I push the Docker Compose file, the YAML file, to our repository, and then in order to orchestrate the containers and do the upgrade, bearing in mind that all Docker Compose builds and then deploys. And when you use something like Docker Compose up, there's a command docker-compose up.
-D.
-D if you want. You don't have to use -D. All that does is detach you from the process, so you've got access to the console. But yes, I do know most of the switches because I use it almost every day. So the difference between Docker Compose allows you to just build the containers, or just to build the images for the containers, and it also, if you use up, it builds the. I'm sorry about the noise outside. It's hideous today. It's not usually, well, I say this probably every podcast. It's not usually as bad as this, but so yeah. The difference between the versions is syntax, and they've removed some features. But when it comes to what Docker Compose is great at, it's great at streamlining your development workflows. That's mainly what it's for.
That's fair enough.
So instead of if you've got, say for example, you've got an app with 3 containers that you need to run, database, app, API. Yeah.
Okay, we'll say that, although mine has a lot more, but yes.
Well, 15, doesn't matter. Whatever you've got. If you want to run that with the Docker commands, so Docker run, Docker build, etc., which you might or might not have used, I'm not sure, because you might have just skipped straight to Compose, for all I know. Then
yeah, I did mostly go straight to Composer.
You would have to run 15 run commands and 15 build commands individually. You would have to manually create the volumes. You would have to manually create the network that they all are associated with. And that's where Docker Compose shines, because it sets all of that up and makes it configurable for you.
It basically abstracts the process of creating containers and just makes it so much nicer. I honestly think that might be where I ran into problems when I first started out with Docker, when it basically did the whole bricky thing or what have you. I didn't have Docker Compose, but it's been a while since I did it. But I don't believe I used Docker Compose. So the Docker Compose is what turned me around to appreciating Docker. Period.
So all Docker Compose is doing though is calling out to Docker. So if you just use Docker on its own, it probably just wasn't stable enough, the version you used, if it's a good while ago. And I don't know what happened or why your machine bricked, but
it's annoying.
So there's quite a few challenges you have to get over when you're working in containers. Things like, how do you persist the data in the containers? Because what a container is it, think of a CD image that you used to burn on our floppy disks, and you used to create an image for a CD, an ISO image, and we'd push, and that's usually a read-only image as well, and we'd push it to our burners, and we'd burn a CD. So what we're doing, and that would be an instance of the image that we've created, because we've got the image on our hard drive. So a container image is essentially a read-only image that you can overwrite. You can overwrite the file, like you can create a new ISO and overwrite the ISO. But you pass environment variables and switches into it to create an instance of the image as a container.
Yes.
And then the containers are essentially arbitrary instantiations of that image that should be set up in such a way that they can be spun down or deleted or lost or recreated with a new image. For example, if you need to upgrade the base operating system or an SDK or something like that. And you can do that with one command or a few commands, or your orchestration software. So the problem is, when you spin a container up, if you haven't made special considerations for it, the database that you create, say for example you create a container with these 3 images and you log onto the website and you add a blog post, that
Mhm.
blog post is saved into the database in container 3, and then you don't know what to do with it.
This this is one of those things that I think, uh, it's the beauty of Docker, but it can be the frustration of people who don't understand how Docker works, like you were saying. Persistence is not Docker's name in a development environment. Not not at all. I mean, when I used to use things like Vagrant or even VirtualBox when trying to do things, you turn it on, you turn it off, and it tries to save the state that you have the current operating system in. It tries to save that, but it eats up a hell of a lot of memory space and it can get corrupted and there's other issues that can come with it. When it comes to Docker, the way I tend to look at the different in my brain, because I use Docker Compose, the different services and things like that. They're literally and the word's not translucent, it's not transparent. They are ephemeral. They literally have zero permanence to them
Oh,
at
I know
all.
the word you're looking for, and I use it all the time, and I've
There's
forgotten it.
there is a word. It means a thing. But like I cannot remember, but it is completely intangible. It is
No.
transitory.
Yeah.
No? Something there's something involving that. Point being, though, when you work in a situation where some of the configuration changes or some of the work you're doing has to be stored in the database or is being set up and that information needs to be stored, if you're having your database destroyed, all every time you shut down or restart your PC or you need to rechange a configuration because you're now using, say, in my case, a different version of PHP, or you're using a different
Or
type
you've
of mailing
uploaded
solution
an
because
image into the WordPress container or something like that.
yeah, or
Anything
what
that
have you,
needs requires
anything,
permanence.
yeah, that you can't do that. Well, you by default, you can't do that. You have to actually do something else. And this is actually what I think I fell in love with Docker Compose for in specific, because it made it very clear to me how it worked. It was, I guess, a different way of looking at Docker because it introduced this concept called volumes. And you and I talked a little bit a while ago about volumes and how they work. And my brain was just like, yeah, I kind of get it, but it didn't make sense to me, but it did. That whole sort of feeling that you can get when you're learning a topic. The way that I ended up looking at this is, anyone who has ever, again, something else we were talking about earlier, done a symlink for your My Documents to be on another drive because your My Documents folder is going to get huge with all the save game files you have from your latest Fallout game. You know what that kind of linking can do. And if you've ever mapped a network drive, it's sort of like that. That's what it felt like to me when I was setting up volumes. I'm like, "Oh, volumes literally mean that container, that Docker container that is designed to not talk to really anything else, has the ability to see as a symlink or a virtual link this particular folder that I have set up." Now, I personally do it locally, so it's this folder on my machine,
Hmm. So
which
it's
is
on the
great.
host machine. So wherever the
It's the
Docker
host machine.
engine is installed, because there's also the other element of Docker, which is the Docker engine, which is the service, the daemon in Linux that is that's running all of the containers and making sure that they stay up and online and running all the time.
Mm,
And on Windows, it's the same as the Docker service, your Windows service that runs in the background, which is essentially the same thing, just run, set up and working
yeah.
for Windows. So yeah, so what happens is volumes are generally set up to map the containers to your host system. So that host system can be responsible for backing up the persistence if you've got a third-party backup tool or system that does things for it.
Mhm.
For example, it can also be used for if I need easy access to something that I don't want to be logging into the container with every 5 minutes, because you don't log on like you do with remote desktop. Like you don't log onto a container and see the virtual desktop. You log on via the shell command line if you're using Linux, or PowerShell, or command if you're using Windows containers, and you log onto it, and then you basically tell it which shell you need to log onto it with, and then you can start using the commands within the container. And then you might get confused because you're like, well, why haven't I got access to Git? Because I've got it on my
Uh,
command line, and then you're like, no, I'm actually inside the container now, writing commands within the container. So volumes allow you to like get access to things like log files. I map my
oh,
log
yes.
drives onto my local
Oh,
machine so I can read them and see them.
exactly, because I actually have a very specific tool I use for reading logs called Tailblazer. Highly recommend it for people who use Windows. Um, but I need to see the errors that are occurring. Period, because it's so important to be able to see where the issues are coming from and having to log in. That starts a whole chain of events that is just incredibly frustrating. Don't put yourself through that. Map a volume
Now,
of just
there's different levels of logging as well within Docker, because you can actually run a Docker log command on any container, and you can see the main console output, which is something as well that you kind of touched on right at the beginning. And we were talking about when a container runs, you're not just running an operating system and having it running it in the background. It's not just sat
Mm-mm.
there waiting for things to happen. It's not running service. I mean, Windows containers do run services in the background, but a very limited set of them. And you can use some things like systemd within Docker containers, but it is a hell of a setup, and it's a massive faff around. And I don't think it's supported or recommended by
Not
Docker
worth
themselves.
it.
Well,
Not worth it.
so basically, what you do with a Docker container is the reason that they are app level containers, and I keep referring to them as app level containers, is that, say, for example, you create a Docker file, and let's say, for example, we are running a WordPress website. Actually, I don't know WordPress off the top of my head, so let's say we're running a .NET service, right?
Yes, I'll go let's say we're running a WordPress service.
Okay,
So,
all right. So
I'll
let's.
do a comparison here. Okay.
Okay, so in a Docker file, have you worked with Docker files as well, Josie, or have you
Yes.
just worked with images that have right?
No, I've got, Docker Compose, which I've used, and Docker files as
So
well
there are two.
because I need them to do various
When
things.
we work with containers, we always need an image to work from, to create a container from.
Yeah.
There are two ways that we can create an image. One is from scratch. Well, there's three ways. One is from scratch, which is like a very, very basic image that we download off the internet, or we could even create the image. I don't know how to do that because I've never needed to, but I'm sure we could create our own image from scratch. Initialize, a base kernel of some description and then build on it. But generally, the way that Docker works is it's layers upon layers upon layers of images. So, for example, if I want to create a .NET Core web API, I would download the .NET Core runtime from the Microsoft Docker Hub. I'd download that image. I would then create, and if I wanted to customize it, say for example, I needed to install my own application and maybe install some of my own tools and some very specific assemblies and all kinds of other things, I would write a Docker file that copies my assemblies or builds my application, copies my assemblies into it, and then at the very end of the Docker file, the last thing that it does is a run command. Now it's either a CMD or an entry point, and they've got two different use cases. Generally, CMD is for running some kind of persistent interactive command like .NET Run assembly name, and that will run your .NET assembly and as a service, and it will host it in the application that comes with .NET, which is Kestrel, the hosting service that comes with .NET, which is Kestrel. There's loads of other ways to do it, but generally this is the way that most people would do it these days. And then the entry point, which is usually a script of some sort that you would run that would do various things every time you start the container. And there's a difference between creating a container and initializing it and starting the container and stopping it and then restarting it again, because there are different things you might need to do in both of those situations. So how does that compare to setting up your WordPress? Because I actually set a WordPress thing up myself a few years ago, and I didn't get very far with it. I had some issues with volume mappings and things like that.
Oh gosh, in my particular case, it's actually pretty simple. I literally tell my Docker Compose file to just grab the latest version of the WordPress image. It is based. You can throw switches at it and say you want PHP to be a particular thing, or you want Linux a particular version, or what have you. You can configure it, but it basically sets up your your web or service provider, and you can pick things like Apache or Nginx from those particular selections. And then the PHP, which is required in order to run, so it sits in the sort of same container. And those two particular things are pretty much all that is present. There's like nothing else. By default, it comes with the mail processor to be able to handle PHP mail. But you can configure the things how you desire
So you're
to
talking about the
work.
Docker, the WordPress Docker
The
image.
Yeah, there is actually a Docker image for
There
WordPress that
didn't
has.
used to be, and I spent a lot of time setting one up and fiddling around with it, and it must be fairly recent because it was only a few years ago that I did that, and I couldn't find
Uh,
a base WordPress image. I essentially
I don't know how long ago this was present. This was up 3 years ago.
was probably a,
It's on Docker Hub, or
yeah.
it's a thing on Docker Hub. Um, but yeah, I mean, in my particular case, I have the ability within the Docker Compose file to set that up. And then I have, because of the fact that it's given consideration to how WordPress is set up with its configuration files for how you set up its connection to the database or things like that, you can actually set that up inside the Docker Compose file itself. And then you tell it where to map the different volumes to. Now, if you wanted to, you could pick to map right to the root of where WordPress is being served from, which is usually var www HTML, usually, although it can vary. It could be files or public or what have you. Or you could explicitly state that the only things you want are the theme files or the plugin files that are found in WP content, which then allows you to do anything that you might want to do, like say work on your plugin or work on your theme without anything else being impacted, because everything else is transient. There's the word we were looking for.
That was it.
Everything else is transient, but you are only working on your plugin, and you can then pick which WordPress you're testing it against. And, those things can be very, very useful. And that's how I do the mapping. Now, for me, because of the fact that WordPress does require a database in order to store literally any kind of information for pretty much how everything works. It's one of the big downsides of WordPress in general, is the fact that a lot of configuration is actually stored in the database, period. But for that, I actually have to set up a database service. And then I have to make certain that the WordPress is talking to the database itself, but I choose to map the volume for the actual database itself,
Hmm.
the specific data. I'm personally, I'm a fan of MariaDB, but everyone has their choices. Some use MySQL, what have you.
Using Maria for my bot at the moment.
Love Maria. But I map the database, and it always knows then when the server starts up to pull from that mapped volume the persistent information that I want. But I also kind of go a step further, and I explicitly tell it to map the Nginx certification SSL cert file to something that I have locally, so that I can actually use SSL certs as well.
So
And but that starts going beyond it. But what I do is I just pull the image of the WordPress with the specific variables that I need it to be, PHP a certain version or what
so
have you.
when you write your Docker Compose file and you do service name
Hmm.
colon underneath it says
Hmm.
name colon image colon, does that say WordPress, or does that say is that a custom name that you've given it,
It's
or does it say
I literally have to go to grab it.
does it
Build.
say image colon then a tag name?
No, it's actually using a Docker Compose Dockerfile image in this particular case, because
You mean
the
you're
one I'm
creating your own local custom image, so you've got a build element in your
there is
Docker Compose file?
yeah, there is a build element in the Docker Compose file.
Okay,
Yes,
so what that's doing there is
I
the
think
image, when
yes,
under
it
the
does.
image tag, that's a custom name that you've defined for your image. So what you're
Hmm.
doing is you're overriding the word. I imagine your Docker file, the first line in it is from WordPress colon,
Yes.
then the tag for whatever it is. So one thing that I got confused with when I very first worked with Docker and Docker Compose was the difference between build arguments and environment variables, and when you pass each one in, and what the scope is
Right.
for each one of them. Have you got that, or is that an element of confusion for you as well?
Well, for me, it is a slight element of confusion, mainly because for me, where did I put this? This is something that I have so recently set up. When I started out with
Because there's
the
security considerations that you might be interested in around these two as well.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, I know WSL. Go away. We'll get to Hyper-V and WSL soon. That's a thing that came up recently with the latest update for Docker, at least locally. But in when pulling the WordPress direct image from
Hmm.
hub.docker.com, um, you're told what environment variables are available for that image. And that's one way of doing it. Whereas in my particular case, I have it pulled out and I'm sending variables because what I have set up is basically, uh, we'll say the foundation
Hmm.
for all of the different things that I do. So I want to be able to make my changes and have different environment
By the
dot ends and things like that
How
for
many
stuff.
services do you have defined in your Docker file?
At this current moment in time, one, two, three, four, five. I have five services
What are each
defined
of
in my
those
document.
services doing? What are their purposes?
One is the latest image of Nginx, which then maps the correct ports for me so that I don't have to put 8080 or anything else like that on there. And I can use
What's
port
that for?
library.
Because WordPress will be hosting itself, I assume, using Nginx or something like
Well,
that.
in this particular case, the build of WordPress that I'm using actually just pulls the WordPress files down into the Nginx container.
Okay, all right.
That at least that's the way that this one is set up. And then it maps the particular volumes, and it depends on WordPress. That's one
So
of the
so
key things that's
the
present.
top level services, you've got a database, MariaDB, you've got your WordPress container, you've got an Nginx container, which I'm still confused about
Mhm.
why you'd need that, but let's go with it. What are the other
It's
two?
I have Mailhog and Composer.
Okay, so Mailhog is a mail engine, a mail server of some sort.
It allows you to, in a web browser, view mail that is being sent without it
Okay,
actually being sent. It basically scarfs up any mails being sent because part of WordPress is about sending emails
yeah.
for various events,
And
etc.
then, sorry, what was the last one?
Composer.
Composer's the PHP. Hang on, no, there's a few different things called Composer. So what is Composer?
Composer is what I am using to pull the plugins and things like that that might be used from the
Right.
WordPress repositories in, and I use it to actually do all of
So
the updating and stuff like that.
Composer is WordPress's not WordPress. It's
Not Word
PHP's
PHPs,
package management
I
tool,
believe so.
like
Yeah.
NuGet is for npm. I haven't used it, so I don't know
Yes.
the details around it. But
I
okay,
believe so.
so
Let's go with yes, I think so.
I don't know if Composer, because what you've set up there, I'm not sure if Composer should be part of that setup. Um,
It
on-
doesn't need to be.
yeah, only because
It
of the reason if
doesn't.
you deploy this file to a server and you use it, it will host and it will expose ports
Which
for
is
that.
not exactly what I'm doing at all.
Right.
I'm using Bedrock, which is a variant of WordPress that has more security to it and stuff like that.
Okay.
So it restructures the WordPress file structure. It adds some extra stuff for password encryption and a few other things as well. And it also allows you to have different configurations based on whether you're on production staging or development, which allows the overrides to work. So, for example, when I have a push of this, because I do
I
have an
see.
instance somewhere, I can literally turn off the ability to do any kind of upload at all with just a simple button, but it allows me to have that. I'm happy with where I'm at with this particular test. I'm now going to push it to staging. It
Yep.
gets pushed in my Git branch to staging, and then it is pulled into the staging server that I have set up, and it is a very one click. It's now ready for me to look
Yep.
at in that, and then I
Well,
can
that's the
use.
intention, isn't it? Of
So that's getting into the dev process.
when
But
you
going back to Docker.
the whole point of Docker is that we should be able to one click. It might take a little while to build and provision the containers sometimes, but once it's set up properly, and especially if you're using caching as well, layer caching within Docker, which is another thing that took me a little bit to get my head around. But I'm at a point now where I usually
Confuses me.
sorry.
Layer caching confuses me.
I'll explain what that is in a minute and what the caveat, like what the there's some gotchas around it. If you are you using multi-step container images at the moment? Are you, when your Dockerfile, do you have multiple from statements in them, or is it just the one?
Just the one.
Okay, so you won't have the. I have had some major caching issues with using multi-step container Docker files, but you won't have that. So, okay, let's talk about layer caching. So when you create a Docker container, every single line, every single instruction in your Docker file is a layer, and what happens is it creates an intermediate container. And that container is accessible via its hash at any point within the build process or any point afterwards, unless you tell Docker build to delete intermediate containers during the process. What that means is that you can log in. So let's say, for example, you've got an add command in your Docker file that adds a file, and then the next line is another add command. Let's just make it simple. So we're adding file1.json, and then in the second one we're adding file2.php. Yeah.
And this is a Docker file.
This is in the Docker file.
Right, because I'm doing more like curl stuff and things like that. But
yeah, okay, so run commands, add and run commands. So run commands run executables, add commands add files. But to run some executables, you need to add files, in order to...
Correct.
If you're creating, for example, in the DNI website, when I'm working locally, I'm modifying files constantly. What an add command does is it takes the files, and then if... It's really, really clever how it does it. If the files that have been added with the add command have not changed, or a copy command, I think copy is the more more common one. I think add's been deprecated, or add's slightly different. I think you can add things from the internet with add as well. You can add URLs, add files from URLs and things like that. But copy, say you're copying a file from your local drive. If that file, or that any of the files that are matched by that glob have not changed, the layer cache will cache what has already happened, so it won't have to rebuild it at that moment. So if you're running command after command after command after command, and it depends on how you've organized your file, and you've got an add right at the end, and then that add adds a file that's changed, all of the run commands will run fine and they will all be cached, but the add, anything that's after the add command, after that file that's changed, will not be cached, and then everything below that will have to be rebuilt. So you sometimes have to organize or it's usually best to organize your Docker file in a way that obviously makes sense to you for your development. There's going to be some instances where...
Yeah.
Okay, here we go. I've actually recently set up a Windows container, which I've now deleted because Windows containers are the worst thing in the world. You should never use them.
Rule number one, by the way, number one frustration. Windows container, our suggestion is...
Delete.
Nope.
Delete.
Nope.
Absolutely not.
Table flip.
I love Microsoft.
Table flip.
I am a Microsoft advocate. I love Microsoft, but Windows containers are utterly screwed at the moment. And I tried years ago to get them working, and it didn't brick my machine or anything, but it didn't work very well. I couldn't get any kind of stable environment for .NET Framework applications. Now, Windows Server Core is a 10 gigabyte image, which is utterly ridiculous considering all Linux images are a couple of 100 meg, or a gig maybe at the worst. And they're just not stable. I can't get anything properly running in them that's consistent, I mean, anyway, I'm not going into it anymore than that. But basically, I had to format my machine because the volume mapping screwed up entirely. Because the volume mapping sucked up hundreds of gigabytes of my hard drive space that I couldn't get back. And I did it again yesterday, and I managed to get it back by reinstalling, I actually did it on a server, reinstalling Docker, mapping the volumes individually I did it in a Docker Compose file because it was easiest way to do it. Mapping the volumes individually, logging into the container, and then doing a RMRF, PowerShell's equivalent, which is remove item dash recurse and then asterisk in each of the individual volumes. That's the only way that I could delete them. I couldn't delete the volume mappings even after I uninstalled Windows from my host machine, and it just sucked up. Oh, it was hideous. I'm lucky
Oh,
I
the
figured it out.
pain.
Anyway,
The
I got carried away then. So yeah, okay. So I'll give you a great example. I have a container, a Windows container, that I am. First of all, the first task that I'm doing is downloading the Windows Server Core .NET 4.8 image. Right. So I've downloaded that. 10 gig download. 3.5 hours later, I know I've got 56k modem still, but 3.5 hours later, I've got the image down. Then Docker can start building on that image with my Dockerfile. The first thing that I do is I install the Visual Studio build tools, which is a download, which is a add command, and then it runs a PowerShell script that I've written, which is a custom script that reads a JSON file, which I copy into the Docker container as well, and reads all of the individual features or components that I want to install within the installer, and I pass that through to the executable and I run it. The next command that I run is install Windows features that I need to enable on the Windows Server Core box. Things like .NET 3.5, IIS, certain IIS services I needed for things. I didn't run it in IIS, but I needed it for certain things. Various bits and bobs, quite a lot. It took a while to run. Now, if I run them in that order, and then I change something with the Windows features, the 10 minutes or so, or 5 minutes that it took to run the VS Build tools will be cached. So I don't have to wait 10 minutes, but then I have to wait another 10 minutes for the Windows script to run, the Windows installer script, which is what I was expect. So you have to make a decision which way round you would install them, because if I'm more likely to change the Visual Studio build tools than I am to change the Windows features, which is I am actually more likely to do that, it's better to put the Windows features underneath it, sorry, the Windows features at the top and the Visual Studio build tools underneath it, so they get installed after the Windows features, which are unlikely to change.
Well, is this something that you pretty much figured out through trial and error, or was it just like,
No,
oh, it makes obvious sense?
I
This is
I
the
I knew
best practice.
when I got into building this particular Windows container, which is probably the most arduous thing I've done because of the speed of the containers, the download speed, because of the size of them, and the sheer fact that installing things on Windows takes 10 million years longer than it does on Linux. It does.
Oh my God, yes.
It's a bigger,
No
bloated,
joke.
more it's a more verbose operating system, let's say. So I knew how the caching worked. So I'm just giving you an example of which way around to do that. However, when it comes to the smaller, more granular things like creating an application, I might have a container that copies everything from my Node.js application into the container, builds it or transpiles it maybe from TypeScript into JavaScript and does everything else it needs to do. And then, so it's copied the files, builds it, and then outputs it. Now, but before it builds it, it actually needs to run npm install.
Right.
So npm install is a package manager. Now, the npm install command might take a little bit of time to do. That's a separate command. When that downloads files, or rather, the npm install command only relies on the package.json file, package.json file.
Right.
I think it's called package.json in Node.js. So instead of copying all of the application files, considering that all of the application files are probably going to change a lot more regularly than the package.json file, you just copy the package.json file, run the npm install command, then copy the rest of the application files. If you do it in that order, then you never, unless you update package.json, which controls the package manager, you never ever need to run, because it caches it, you never need to run the npm install command again because it's cached as a layer. So if you look at the output when you run Docker Compose, or you look at the output when you run Docker Build, you'll see that it will cache certain things. Do it with something small. I could show you an example now of something really small. I'm not going to because
we're not going to, because we are literally like I'm so wrapped up in this conversation. I totally miss the timing.
I can talk forever. I absolutely love Docker, and it's really intricate how it works. There's so many things we haven't covered today. But
well, yeah, I mean, this is the thing. I mean, at this current moment in time, we don't have a guest next week. We might actually just need to continue our Docker conversation next week. Actually do a continuous stream of thought. What happened to documentation not included?
Well, now you're a bit more invested. Next time you're on the development stream, I may be able to take a what's it called, a digression side thing or
And
whatever.
I would
And
love to be able to show you a couple of different
yeah,
versions of how you can do a WordPress setup in Docker as well. So we may have to do an actual show and tell during a show, which might be a pain for those of you who are, podcast listeners. We'll have to think about it.
well, we do development shows, don't we? So we don't.
We
We'll do that
do.
on the dev
It's
show, I think.
when work is not swamping the hell out
It
of
is.
us.
And I
Holy
said,
cow.
for anyone who is listening who does watch the development podcast streams, it's not happened for the last few weeks because I did a 8-day week last week, and this week I've already done my full week's worth of work, so I'm having tomorrow off.
Yeah, whereas in my particular case, I am absolutely swamped. I've had so many new projects land on my lap, and it's almost like everyone's like, "We've got time. Now's the time to invest in." So I'm working with a lot of different people for a variety of things, from the marketing side of things on down to public facing stuff. Point being, though, we love you. We're not really going away. We've just been busy. We're sorry.
I'm
So
hoping I'm going to get a
I
development stream done tomorrow, actually.
You might be able to. I mean, sadly I can't because I've got quite a few meetings, but um I honestly feel in a way this entire show has been a bring your own manual.
Yeah.
In the end, we want to try to help and educate and introduce people. And we've gone over quite a few different things with Docker. For some of you who are new to Docker, we hope you go to explore it because it is actually it's saving me time. Where I'm losing the time right now in the whole usage of Docker is making certain that I've got the Docker files set up right, that I've got Docker Compose set up right, and that I have it doing the things that I need it to do. Because I could, with one very easy, set of commands, just have a WordPress site spin up and not be persistent. But I have other things that are a requirement. So I have to break my entire WordPress setup down into different chunks for very
I
specific reasons.
I have a
But
BYOM for people if we're not if I
go
know the
ahead.
whole thing.
What's your BYOM?
So my BYOM relates to Docker, and it's not something I've learned, but it's something that people who are listening to the podcast who might be interested in Docker can go off and learn themselves. Go download Docker on whatever machine you're on if you're interested in it, and then write Docker space run space hello-world, and there you are. You have a Docker container on your machine that's downloaded from the internet that's already a little self-contained. You can run, thing is with Docker, you can run one-off commands with it, so you can use it to do one job, or you can use it to run a persistent container that runs an application, which is what we're talking about here, which does, when you think about production environments and when you think about making things scalable and making things manageable for a wider solution. Yes, you need to spend more time setting it up, but the time saving you get and
at the end
benefits you get, especially if you combine it with the cloud as well, if you combine it with something like AWS or Azure DevOps, Azure containers, or what's the other one, Google Platform containers, there's loads of them. I mean, I use DigitalOcean for all mine, and I
love DigitalOcean.
They've got boxes that you can just one click and you've got a Kubernetes cluster straight away available to you.
Yeah, I was actually thinking to myself, should I bother with Kubernetes, because it can actually be I use GitLab for my stuff.
I think you will
GitHub.
use it. I think if I know your business as much as I think I do, I think your business would benefit if you start Dockerizing everything. You will need, because I know you like monitoring as well. You'll need to use Kubernetes to monitor it, to monitor your files and your networks out there.
We'll see, because Elk is gorgeous. That's all I'm going to say. Elk is godly.
I haven't used Elk, so I don't know.
Worship the ground Elk walks on, for those of you. Although it's interesting because Elk is based in Java, which is a whole nother can of worms and a discussion unto itself. Anyway, my BYOM has absolutely nothing to do with development. My BYOM has everything to do with the dangers of playing Eldritch Horror, the board game. Playing fan-made things, you're gonna die. The King in Yellow, really fun expansion for that. But yeah, City in Ruins basically kicked my butt. Well, a friend of mine's in my butt this past week. Just, appreciate the old gods is really the lesson I have for you today.
Way over my head. Way over my head.
Nothing to do with it. But yes, we're at the end of our show. Thank you to everybody in Twitch who has showed up. It has been a fun topic of conversation because I love Docker, but I hate Docker at the same time. But I'm growing to appreciate it. You can love and hate something and still respect it. There is a thing to be had there.
Mm.
And for everyone who is listening, oh, there's a ghost in chat.
Mhm.
Hello, ghost. Hi, Mike. But thank you to everyone of you who is in the future listening to us. If you have any tips, pointers, or anything about Docker and want us to have it, let us know. Send it to us. We'll bring it up in the next show because I have a feeling we're going to just continue Docker because I am very much so invested in Chris's advocate Docker Central.
I
Um,
think somebody should look back on this podcast and count how many times we said Docker.
oh my God. Potentially. There may or may not
Thousands.
be a prize.
It may be infinite. It may be an infinite number of Dockers.
Recursive Docker, because you can't have Docker inside a Docker container, which is something. And thank you, Farida. Farida has
I'm
actually.
assuming that's some kind of.
I am not saying that live on air because that might actually summon Cthulhu, and we don't want to have that kind of a thing, especially when I get a kick out of this. There are things in the development world with tentacles. I'll grant it, it's called octopus, but it has tentacles, and all I can think of is that. And of course, my favorite Git client personally is a kraken of some kind. So, meh. Thank you.
Funnily enough, I'm using Octopus's compression, Delta compression rsync implementation in my network backup tool. I'm using their core libraries for it, which is quite cool. And that's used to send data out to their octopus tentacles. Their tentacles in the octopus. They've got, I think, calamari as well is another one of their services that they're using. I can't remember what that is exactly, but
in all honesty, we just need to name things what they should be. The summoning of the old gods.
I like the thing is with octopus though, it's actually a great name because octopus has tentacles and all the octopus, the center of the octopus is actually calling out to all the different servers and all the different services
and touching
that
it
it's
with
monitoring
their
and deploying to and stuff. I love octopus is a great tool.
Absolutely.
Anyway, so yes,
Pick up on the roof.
You can visit our website on www.dnistream.live where you can find links to all our social media channels and podcast links and catchers and everything else. You can also use it to contact us for any reason if you want to be a guest, you want to know what Docker is if we've not explained it very well, and give us feedback.
Send us corrections.
Send us a funny joke, or just compliment my beard. I don't mind.
Yeah, and lament the fact that I can't grow one.
And don't forget, you can also follow us on Twitch, which is down there, over there, that way. If you haven't
It depends on what platform you happen to be on.
Indeed, if you're not already following us, follow us now, or I'll find you. Send the boys round.
Yes, and as a reminder for those of you who are listening to us in the future, our podcast goes live onto YouTube and Twitch across all the podcast platforms Monday at 7 a.m. However, we do hope that we can actually see you live, or we can discuss things with you live in chat. We do have a Discord. Hopefully see you there, and we see you next week, 7 p.m. Thursday UK time on twitch.tv/DNI stream. All that's left to do is say goodbye. So goodbye to everybody in chat. Goodbye, Chris.
Goodbye. But hang around, we'll do a raid in a minute. We're going to get quite an interesting person we're going to raid today as well, so hang around. So bye, everyone.
Bye.